The Court of Nine Heavens had been judging young species for 4,000 years. It was not a place. It was an agreement, a compact between the 11 eldest god lines of the spiral, each one older than the stars their worshippers still counted by hand. Every century, the court opened a single seat for a species that had survived long enough, killed enough of its own monsters, and buried enough of its own dead to be considered for standing among the old powers. In 4,000 years, only 41 species had been offered that seat. 38 had taken it. The acceptance rate was 11%. The species that failed were not destroyed. They were simply forgotten, quietly removed from the registries, their gods reassigned to smaller, hungrier courts where nobody kept records anyone read twice. Humanity had been on the list for 600 years. It had been reviewed 9 times. 9 times the review had ended the same way, promising but not ready. The 10th review was scheduled for this century. Nobody in the court expected it to end differently. The reasons given, across 9 reviews, had never changed much. Too fragmented, too young. A species that had not yet agreed on a single language, let alone a single government, was not a species the court considered stable enough to sit among gods who had outlived galaxies. The 11 eldest god lines had reviewed empires that rose and fell in a single human lifetime, and had learned, through 4,000 years of practice, to be patient with young species and unimpressed by their claims. What the court had never done, in 600 years of reviewing humanity, was look closely at the one category of record every species submitted, but almost none of them wanted examined too carefully. The record of what that species had done to the gods it had already met, long before this court existed. The species being reviewed did not attend its own hearing. Instead, it sent an envoy, one person, chosen not by vote but by an older method the court itself did not fully understand, one that had produced over 600 years, envoys who were never the strongest human alive, and never the loudest. The method had a name in no language the court could translate cleanly. The closest human word for it was chosen, though nobody could explain what chose, or why it had picked the 9 before this one, or why every one of them had walked into the long chamber with the same unhurried stillness. This century, the envoy's name was Corin Ash. Corin Ash was 34 years old, from a coastal town that had been rebuilt 4 times in 300 years, and had stopped naming its storms because there had been too many worth remembering. The court's registrar, an old sky being named Fentha who had processed envoys for over 1,000 years, had read Corin's file twice. The first read had produced a number that did not match the species' technological standing. The second read, done with a verification seal Fentha rarely bothered to use, had confirmed it. Corin's world had no starships of its own. It had no standing army larger than what a single nation could field. By every metric the court used to measure a species' readiness: energy output, unified governance, weapons capable of reaching orbit, humanity ranked in the bottom third of every species ever reviewed. There was one number that did not fit that ranking. Fentha had stared at it for a long time before filing the report unchanged. It was not a number about weapons or fleets or territory. It was a number about survival. How many times the species' own historians had recorded an event they classified, in their own records, as should have ended us. Fentha had cross-checked the figure against every comparable species the court had ever reviewed. No other species came close. Fentha filed the number anyway without comment because it was not the registrar's place to interpret the file, only to confirm it was accurate. Corin did not mention it. He arrived at the court's outer chamber 3 days early, found the guest quarters assigned to him, and spent those 3 days reading. Not about the court, not about the gods he was about to stand before, but about the 600 years of prior human envoys, all of whom had said some version of the same thing and been sent home the same way. He read their transcripts start to finish, twice, the way a person studies the losses of everyone who tried before them, not to avoid their mistakes, but to understand what question nobody had thought to ask back. He spoke to almost no one in those 3 days. The court staff who passed his quarters described him afterward in similar terms, without having compared notes first. A man who worked the way water moves, without hurry, without waste, always arriving exactly where it was going. He carried one object with him that did not belong in a celestial court. A compass old, its glass cracked, its needle no longer reliable. It had belonged to someone in his family long enough ago that nobody remembered whose it originally was. It did not point north anymore. It had not pointed north in decades. He kept it anyway in his coat pocket and turned it over once without looking at it, whenever a room went quiet around him. He did not explain it to anyone who asked, and by the second day, the staff had stopped asking. The hearing took place in the long chamber, where the 11 eldest godlines sat in a circle around a floor made of compressed starlight, and where every prior human review had ended in the same polite, unanimous decline. Among the 11, one seat belonged to Viral, a god of the Ashcrown line, 4,000 years old in a body that had chosen to look no older than a young adult, undefeated in every ceremonial contest the court had held in the last 3 centuries. Viral had been given the honor of opening the human review, a task usually reserved for the eldest present. It was given to him because he had asked for it, and because the 11 had, without discussion, decided this was a formality that did not require someone senior. Several of the gods in the chamber were already smiling before Viral spoke, the particular kind of smile that appears in rooms where an old hierarchy is about to be confirmed rather than tested. Viral rose. He did not rush the moment. He let the silence sit long enough that everyone understood a question was coming. The way certain gods introduce questions they have already decided the answer to, with the timing and tone of someone who has rehearsed being casual. Before we begin the formal review, Viral said, I have always been curious about something. Humans keep records of your own violence with unusual precision. So, out of curiosity, not judgment, how many of your own gods has your species killed? Several of the 11 laughed, quietly, the sound of a joke landing exactly where it was thrown. It was not meant as an insult. It was meant as the kind of question you ask a species you have already decided will not make the cut, a question with no correct answer, because a low number confirms weakness and a high number confirms savagery. Viral had chosen it carefully. It was the kind of question that let the room agree with him without anyone needing to say the verdict out loud. The other gods in the circle did not need to be told which side of the room to sit on. 2 of the eldest exchanged a glance that had nothing to do with humanity at all, the particular look shared by people who have sat through 9 identical reviews and expect the 10th to run the same course. A younger god near the back, barely 300 years into her line, smiled the widest of anyone, the smile of someone who had learned the room's expected reaction before she had learned to question it. Elder Sana, the court's keeper of records, seated at the head of the circle, said nothing. She had requested the archive logs on human mythological conflict in the 2nd week after Corin's envoyship was confirmed. Long before Viral had been assigned to open the hearing, long before anyone but Sana herself knew what question the archive would eventually be needed to answer. She had watched 5 centuries of reviews open with some version of the same casual cruelty, dressed as curiosity, and had learned that the fastest way to correct a room was never to argue with it. It was to let it ask the question it thought was safe. She had been waiting for exactly this question to be asked, by exactly someone like Viral, for exactly this long. That's a fair question, Corin said, in the tone of someone who genuinely thought it was. Do you want the number my species remembers, or the number that's actually recorded? Viral's smile did not move yet. There's a difference. There's always a difference, Corin said. The recorded number is 143. The chamber's laughter stopped the way a wave stops, the ones closest to Corin first, then outward, until the whole room had gone quiet at once. Elder Sana rose without being asked to. "With the court's permission," she said, "I would like to show the record rather than summarize it." Nobody objected. The chamber's floor of compressed starlight dimmed, and the archive began. The footage was not staged. It was not the kind of dramatized reenactment the court sometimes used for ceremonial purposes. It was documentary, pulled directly from the memory threads of gods who had been present, cross-referenced against human accounts recovered independently, centuries apart, that matched in every detail that mattered. The first case was small, a minor storm god of a river delta, worshipped for 11 generations, who had demanded tribute during a famine and been drowned in his own flooded temple by the people he had been starving. Elder Sana did not comment. She let the footage run its length, then moved to the next. The second case was a war god who had promised victory to both sides of a 6-year conflict, collecting worship and sacrifice from each, until the two human armies discovered the deception independently and turned their combined force on his shrine instead of each other. He had not survived the alliance he accidentally created. By the third case, Viral was no longer smiling. He was watching with the expression of someone recalculating a number they had assumed was settled. The fourth case took longer to show, because it involved a god who had not simply been killed but replaced, worshipped out of existence over 2 generations. His temples repurposed, his name deliberately left out of every surviving record, erased not through violence but through a species that had simply decided he was no longer useful and stopped believing on schedule together, without ever holding a vote on it. The fifth case involved a mountain god who had ruled a valley for 9 generations through a single, simple threat: that the harvest would fail if the tribute did not arrive by the first frost. On the 10th generation, the valley's farmers had spent 2 winters quietly studying the mountain's actual weather patterns instead of the god's warnings, and had discovered the failed harvests correlated with nothing the god controlled at all. The tribute stopped the following year. The god's threats continued for another decade before the valley simply stopped listening, and a god who is not listened to, the footage showed, fades the same way a fire does when nobody feeds it. The sixth case took the room longer to sit with than any before it, because it did not involve deception at all. A healer god, worshipped honestly and without complaint for over 3 centuries, had asked her people for a final tribute during a plague that had no cure, in exchange for a mercy she could not actually provide. When the plague ended on its own, through the slow work of human medicine rather than divine intervention, the survivors did not turn on her in anger. They simply stopped, one household at a time, believing she had done anything at all not out of cruelty, the record showed, but because a species capable of solving its own plague no longer needed a god's explanation for having survived one. The 7th case was the one Elder Sana had chosen to show last. It was recent, within the last 3 centuries, well inside the memory of half the gods in the chamber. A minor pantheon of 7 had attempted to establish worship on a newly settled human colony that had no prior contact with any god line. The 7 had introduced themselves as saviors during the colony's first crop failure. By the second failure, the colony had determined, through methodical observation rather than faith, that the 7 gods were siphoning the very resources they claimed to be providing. There had been no war. There had been a vote, a blockade of every shrine, and a slow, patient starvation of belief until all 7 gods had faded out of relevance within 4 years, not killed in the traditional sense, but ended all the same. By the 8th instance in the archive, Elder Sana had prepared 11, though she only needed to show 7 before the room understood. Viral was not watching the footage anymore. He was watching Corin. Corin did not speak during any of it. He sat with his hand resting near the pocket that held the old compass, watching the same footage everyone else was watching, his expression unreadable in the specific way of someone who has seen this record before and is only now watching the room catch up to it. The chamber had gone fully silent, The kind of silence that does not need anyone to call for order because nobody in the room has anything left to say. Viral stood first. He crossed to the chamber's edge and stopped at the threshold before leaving. "The number you gave me," he said, without turning around, "and the number in the archive. They're not the same." "No," Corin said. "The recorded number is higher. 143 is only the ones we're certain of." Viral said nothing further. He left the chamber the way a person leaves a room after recalculating something they had assumed was finished. Not humiliated, not defeated in any way that would show on a ceremonial record, simply updated. Corin stood, gathered nothing but the coat with the compass still in its pocket, and walked toward the same door. Elder Sana caught him before he reached it. "Since the second week of your envoyship," she said, "I have been waiting for someone to ask that exact question. I did not expect it to be Viral. I am glad it was." Corin looked at her for a moment, the way someone looks at a person who has just admitted to setting a trap on their behalf. "You could have shown that archive without waiting for a question," he said. "It was not an accusation. It sounded, if anything, like curiosity." "I could have," Sana said. "Nobody in this chamber would have believed a record they were not asked to see. They needed to think they were laughing first." He did not ask why she had chosen to help a species she had never met in 600 years of reviews. He nodded once instead, the way a person nods at an answer they had already worked out for themselves, and continued toward the door. The rest of the chamber emptied slowly behind him, the 11 leaving in the particular quiet that follows a room realizing it had misjudged something, each of them carrying the realization out at their own pace. Elder Sana returned to her seat, opened the court's oldest ledger, the one used only for final standings, updated perhaps once a decade, and beside humanity's 600-year entry wrote 3 words.